Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. To story 1. This happened to my dad many years ago. He's no longer with us, but this story stayed alive in our family as one of the few times we ever saw genuine fear cross his face. It wasn't just a story to him, it was a memory, a haunting imprint that stayed deep within him. He rarely shared it, and when he did, it was usually after a few drinks loosened him up enough to speak the words. The expression he wore as he told it was always the same, a strange mix of disbelief, dread, and that unmistakable vulnerability that didn't seem to belong on someone as stoic as my father. He worked in the army, though he never told us exactly where this happened. He kept the location vague, perhaps because of security, or maybe because he didn't want to relive too much. From what we know, it happened on a base at least 50 years ago, during one of his patrol shifts, out in a rural part of the installation. The area was formerly inhabited, but by the time it was converted into a military zone, the nearby houses had been long abandoned or destroyed. A few remained tucked away in the overgrown woods, old skeletal structures left to decay and considered too much effort to tear down. These ghost houses were mostly ignored by the personnel, dismissed as relics from a time before the base took over. On one particularly quiet night, sometime after midnight, my father was making a solo round on one of those small patrol vehicles. The world around him was still, the air heavy with night sounds, nothing but the chorus of crickets and the distant rustle of trees. But then, something shifted. Out of the corner of his eye, movement. Something unnatural disturbed the otherwise calm rhythm of the woods. He stopped the vehicle and shone his flashlight toward the direction of the motion. Someone was there. He radioed in, reporting a possible intruder, and carefully advanced toward the old houses. The underbrush cracked beneath his boots as he closed in. His flashlight flicked between the trees, and he thought he heard something soft. Fabric, maybe, swishing as it brushed past leaves. He approached one of the old homes. It stood like a withered memory, its porch sagging, its door slightly ajar. The whole place exuded neglect. He hesitated, then entered. The musty air hit him immediately, thick with dust and decay. Inside, everything felt stale, quiet except for the sound of his own cautious steps on the creaking floorboards. He cleared the downstairs quickly, each room empty and worn, then ascended the stairs, the wood groaning beneath him. At the top, 3 small rooms awaited. He checked them one by one until the last room revealed a ladder to an attic. That's when the real unease set in. He didn't want to climb that ladder. Something about it felt wrong. Still, procedure dictated a full inspection, so up he went, each rung groaning under his weight. One step snapped, nearly sending him down, but he caught himself and pushed onward. In the attic it was cold. Dust particles floated in the flashlight's beam. The space was cramped, filled with old children's toys and sheets covering what seemed to be discarded furniture. Behind one of those sheets, a lump. He moved in, pulled the sheet away. Nothing. His breath slowed. His shoulders dropped. No one was there. With relief flooding in, he climbed back down and left the house, noting that his radio still hadn't received any updates. That was strange, but not entirely out of the ordinary. He returned to his vehicle, inserted the keys, and that's when he saw it again. Another shadow moved by the edge of the woods. He spun the flashlight toward it. Whatever it was seemed to dart back toward the same house. This time, his curiosity became urgency. He ran, bursting around the house with the flashlight cutting through the dark. He expected to catch whoever it was. But again, no one. The door hadn't moved. It still creaked horribly when opened, so he would have heard if it had been used, and that was when things took a turn from strange to terrifying. As he rounded the house one final time, he heard a light tap, just one, on a window pane. He stopped, every sense on alert. Slowly he turned to look at the window, and in that moment, dread surged through his veins like a flood. In the window stood a towering shadow, easily over 8 feet tall, its eyes glowing red. Those eyes weren't just reflecting light. They seemed alive. My dad described them as the kind of red that wasn't natural, like something you weren't supposed to see. He said the figure behind the window had the unmistakable shape of a man, but with proportions that defied human norms. Broad, hulking, and unmoving, it watched him in complete silence. He froze, heart pounding. A second passed, then two, then he bolted. Pure instinct took over. He sprinted to his vehicle, barely remembering to breathe. The keys fumbled in his hands, but he finally managed to start the engine and tear away from that cursed place. He didn't stop until he reached the operations center, and even then, he didn't report what he saw. Not officially. He told no one, kept it locked away for years. It was only much later, at a small gathering with a few colleagues and drinks flowing freely, that the topic of the abandoned houses came up. Someone asked if anyone had ever gone inside one. That's when my dad finally spoke. He casually mentioned that he had, and that he saw something, but claimed it turned out to be nothing. One of the men suddenly grew quiet. He leaned in and asked my dad a strange question. "Did you see the eyes? Were they red?" My dad didn't speak at first. He just looked at him, and slowly he nodded. It was a moment of unspoken understanding. Two people silently confirming something unspeakable. The group around them didn't seem to catch the weight of what had passed between them. But for those two men, something had connected. Something real. Something dark. And something that had followed them both. They never discussed it again. Not a single word was said between them about that night, but the silence said everything. My dad never inspected abandoned properties again. He avoided that sector altogether, requesting reassignment any time he was sent near those woods. It wasn't just fear. It was a belief, deep and unshakable, that what he saw wasn't human. That whatever lived in that forgotten house wasn't meant to be disturbed. It was as if the land itself had a memory, and my dad had briefly touched a part of it that wanted to be left alone. He carried that memory quietly for the rest of his life, only sharing it on rare occasions. And each time, his voice trembled just slightly, just enough to let you know that the fear never really left him. We asked him once what he thought it really was. A ghost? A demon? Some figment of stress and imagination? But he only shook his head and said, "I don't know what it was. I just know it wasn't supposed to be there. Or maybe I wasn't." That line stuck with me. The way he said it so quietly, with his eyes gazing off like he could still see that red glow in the window. My dad was the kind of man who didn't scare easy. War had hardened him. Life had tested him. But whatever he saw that night had cut through all that armor. It had reminded him of something ancient, something beyond our understanding. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. Not knowing what's out there, but knowing it's watching. Waiting. Just behind a window pane, just tall enough to make you realize how small you really are. Story 2. It was the first time I had my own space, my own place in the world. No roommates, no shared bills, just a one-bedroom apartment. That was small, a little run down, and far from glamorous, but perfect for me at the time. I had just moved out of a share house in the suburbs and into the city, closer to my job, and just a short walk from one of the most popular nightlife strips. I was in my mid-20s and figured I could finally live the way I wanted. Walking distance from the clubs, the bars, the chaos of the night. The apartment was cheap, the location unbeatable for someone my age, and I didn't need much to be happy. I settled in quickly, unpacked just enough to feel comfortable, and invited my friends over that first weekend for drinks before hitting the town. We laughed, played music a bit too loud, and spilt beer on the tile floor. I felt light. But in between songs I heard something else. The faint sounds of an argument coming from the apartment next door. I pressed my ear to the wall, curious. The building was old, which meant the walls were thin, practically paper. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough to get the gist. It was a couple arguing. From the tones and voices, I guessed it was two men, likely in their early 30s. One voice was louder, harsher, commanding. The other was quieter, trying to de-escalate. I gathered that the louder one, who I later learned was named Rick, was angry about the noise coming from my apartment. He wanted the other man, Chris, to come over and tell us to keep it down. Chris protested, trying to calm Rick, insisting it was just a housewarming and that they should let it slide for the night. I didn't want to cause trouble on my first night, so I hushed my guests and nudged everyone to finish their drinks quickly so we could head out. As we left, the hallway felt oddly still, like the air was waiting for something. When I got home later that night, sometime after 2 a.m, the hallway was empty and silent again. I fumbled with my keys and finally looked up, only to see someone standing in the walkway just ahead. It was a man, tall and thin, smoking a cigarette in front of the next door apartment. His hair was brown, longish and oily, and he had a split lip and what looked like a healing black eye. "Good day," I said, trying to sound friendly, even though a small part of me felt off about him. "Sorry about the noise earlier," I added, assuming he was one of the neighbours. He smiled, soft, broken, and said, "Nah, you're right, mate. I'm Chris." We shook hands, and I noticed his knuckles were red and a little bloody, the kind of scrapes that come from punching walls, or maybe worse. I apologised again for the noise, but he brushed it off with a brittle chuckle, saying, "Rick just gets a bit cranky sometimes. I'm used to it." That stuck with me. I watched him retreat back into his apartment, and the door closed without a sound. Weeks passed, and I got used to the sound of shouting through the walls. Chris and Rick, if they were two people, argued often, loudly. Their arguments would swell and crash like waves, punctuated by furniture moving, bottles being slammed, or muffled sobbing. I started to piece together the dynamics. Rick had the deeper, more aggressive voice. Chris always sounded like he was pleading. I kept my distance. I never knocked on their door, never asked if they were okay, though I often wondered. I convinced myself it was better not to get involved. I started declining invitations to host friends over, preferring to meet them elsewhere so I wouldn't have to endure the angry outbursts or the lingering discomfort that always followed. Every now and then I heard them argue about me, mostly Rick accusing Chris of liking me, of paying me too much attention. It made my skin crawl, and it only confirmed my decision to keep my head down and stay invisible. Then came Christmas Eve. I had just come home from some last-minute shopping. My arms were full of bags, and I was tired but content, looking forward to wrapping presents and spending Christmas Day with my family. As I walked toward the building, I saw police cars parked out front, lights washing the street in red and blue. A woman from a few apartments down, Anna, a kind older lady, was sobbing uncontrollably on the sidewalk. I dropped my bags and asked her what had happened. "It's just so sad," she kept repeating, unable to form the words. I turned my attention toward the commotion and saw several officers restraining someone. It was Chris, or at least the man I thought was Chris. His face was covered in blood, a deep gash cut into his cheek like someone had tried to carve it open. His jaw hung strangely, like it had been dislocated, and he was crying, apologizing, and resisting all at once. Just then, a booming voice erupted from somewhere nearby. "You see what you've done? You loser, just kill yourself! Ah!" The rage in that voice stopped me cold. I turned slowly, scanning the area for Rick, but I couldn't find him. The shouting continued, but the only person speaking was Chris. That's when it clicked. My heart dropped. The yelling, the drinking, the arguing I had been hearing for weeks, It had all come from one person, but if Chris and Rick were the same man. There was no abusive partner, there was no dominant voice towering over a submissive one. It was all him. I stood frozen in the hallway, watching officers struggle to restrain a man who had spent months pretending to be two people. My breath caught in my throat, the illusion shattered, and I suddenly felt incredibly exposed, as if the whole building had been a stage and we had all been actors in his private performance. Later I learned from Anna that this wasn't the first time the police had taken him away. Apparently Chris, or Rick, or whoever he was, had spent time at a psychiatric hospital more than once. His father owned the apartment, so it stayed vacant, but waiting, always waiting, until he got out and returned to the same broken loop. He was sick, that much was clear. But what haunted me wasn't just the delusion or the violence, it was how well he had hidden it. The bruises, the voices, the carefully divided roles. He had constructed an entire world inside that crumbling apartment wall, and I had believed it, all of it. The black eye, the apologies, the trembling voice of Chris asking for peace, and the cruel voice of Rick demanding silence. He was both abuser and victim, tormentor and tormented, and I had never seen it. I moved out shortly after. I didn't even wait for the lease to end. I couldn't walk past that apartment without feeling watched, or worse, remembered. Every time I passed the door, I imagined him pacing inside, rehearsing his next conversation, his next argument, his next breakdown. I imagined him sitting on that threadbare couch, switching voices back and forth in the flickering light of a broken lamp, surrounded by empty bottles and echoes of his own making, and the worst part, I felt sorry for him. I didn't want to, but I did. Not because he deserved it, but because I saw a glimpse of how much pain he must have been in to need an entire second self just to survive. That kind of loneliness, that kind of fragmentation, it leaves scars deeper than any wound you can see. Even now, I sometimes wonder what happened to him, whether he ever got help, or whether the loop just repeated in another place, another building, with new neighbours who'd one day discover the truth the way I did. The world is filled with people like him, slipping through the cracks, barely noticed until something finally snaps. And we pretend not to see them, not because we're heartless, but because the truth they carry is too heavy to hold. They remind us how thin the line really is, between sanity and unravelling, between being someone and becoming someone else just to cope. Chris wasn't a monster. He was broken. He lived in the shadow of a man he invented to punish himself. And that is what keeps me awake some nights, the idea that someone can be their own worst enemy, their own tormentor, their own Rick. To story 3. My wife went to university with a woman who had a noticeable, jagged scar running the length of her throat. An old wound that no scarf or makeup could ever completely hide. It caught attention, certainly, but no one dared to ask. It was one of those silent marks that radiated both trauma and survival. One day over coffee and the soft rustling of library pages, this woman, her name was Erin, opened up and told my wife the story behind it. It wasn't for sympathy. She didn't want pity. She just wanted someone to understand. She had been followed home one afternoon after school by a stranger. She hadn't noticed him at first. He blended into the background of the day, just another person walking, another figure on the sidewalk. But once she turned the corner and headed into the quieter streets, he was still there. She began to walk faster, heart starting to race, but it was too late. He grabbed her from behind, dragged her into the bushes, and with a knife slashed her throat. The man had no mercy. He didn't just cut her, he wanted her silent, wanted her to disappear. After he slashed her throat, he raped her. She drifted in and out of consciousness during the ordeal, her vision swimming in blood and fear. But something primal kicked in, some spark of survival that refused to go out. She regained partial awareness in the middle of the attack. Her body was broken, her voice gone, but her hands still worked. She managed to get her thumb into his mouth, and with every ounce of strength she had left, dug her nail in and tore his cheek wide open. It was a savage, desperate move, and it worked. The man reeled back in shock, his own pain now distracting him enough for her to crawl away. She stumbled out into the street, barely alive, and someone saw her, thank God. The ambulance came, the police came, and she survived. The trial was brutal. The man was arrested, tried, and found guilty. But the court proceedings weren't what you might hope for in a civilized society. The judge, in his cold detachment, decided that because Erin had been unconscious for most of the rape, her suffering was less than someone who had been aware the whole time. He gave the man a reduced sentence, only 6 years. 6 years for stealing her voice, her body, and a piece of her soul. My wife told me that Erin's family was devastated, furious and helpless, but they didn't stay silent. They appealed the leniency of the sentence and managed to get it increased. 7 years total. 1 more year. One more symbolic gesture that justice had in the end still fallen short. My wife said Erin didn't cry when she heard the new verdict. She just nodded, folded her hands, and walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. It's easy to forget the people we pass by each day. Strangers on the train, someone serving you coffee, the person sitting in the library, but sometimes the strongest people carry scars that tell stories you wouldn't believe. Erin didn't let what happened define her, but it became a part of her. It shaped the way she spoke, the way she walked into a room, the way she looked at people who talked too loudly or stood too close. She never saw herself as a victim. That was the most startling part of her strength. She said once that she didn't want people to look at her and feel sorry. She wanted them to look at her and know they could survive too. That even if the world tried to end you, you could still choose to keep going. The scar on her neck was like a thread sewn across her skin, stark, red and impossible to miss. But she never covered it. She wore open collars, low necklines, anything that allowed the world to see what she had lived through. When someone asked her why, she said, "If I hide it, he wins. If I act like it didn't happen, he gets to pretend it was nothing." And that philosophy seeped into everything she did. She studied criminal justice, not for revenge, but because she wanted to work on the other side of the courtroom, to be someone who could change how these cases were handled. She interned at the district attorney's office and volunteered at crisis centres. She said it helped her sleep at night, knowing she was doing something. What stuck with me most was something my wife said after telling me the story. She said, "You'd never know just by looking at her how much fire lives behind her eyes." Erin laughed often. She had a dry sense of humour and a warm laugh that seemed almost too big for someone who had been through what she had. But maybe that's exactly why she laughed. Because she had already seen how dark the world could be. Because she had looked evil in the eye and survived. There's a quiet power in that kind of resilience. The kind that doesn't need to shout. The kind that doesn't look for applause. It just walks forward, one day at a time, refusing to be broken. I think about Erin more often than I'd expect, not just because of what happened to her, but because of the way she chose to live afterward. There's something sacred about that choice. The world tells you that you're supposed to be afraid, supposed to stay small after trauma, but Erin didn't. She didn't retreat. She stepped out into the light and let people see every inch of what she had endured. That takes more courage than most people ever realize. And in a way, her story isn't just about survival. It's about reclaiming control, taking back power from someone who tried to take everything. And that's a kind of victory that no reduced sentence can ever erase. The years passed, and Erin built a life, a career, a circle of close, loyal friends. She still bore the scar, but it faded slightly with time, like a reminder that even wounds can soften if you give them space. She didn't talk about the attack much, only when it mattered, only when someone else needed to know that they weren't alone. I heard that she eventually started a support group for survivors of violent crime, just a quiet gathering in the back room of a local community centre. But to the people who went, it meant everything. She'd sit with them, listen, and remind them in that firm, unwavering voice that they were still here, that they still had a right to laugh, to breathe, to dream. Sometimes I wonder what became of the man who hurt her, whether he ever thought about what he'd done, or if the short sentence confirmed to him that it wasn't that serious. Monsters don't often lose sleep over the lives they ruin, but survivors, they carry everything. They carry the fear, the judgment, the endless whispers of what if and why me. And yet, in all that weight, they find a way to move. Erin didn't live in fear. She lived in defiance of it, and in doing so, she gave others permission to do the same. Her story may have begun in horror, but it didn't end there. It ended in strength, in purpose, in a life that refused to be silenced. I never met Erin myself, but through my wife's memories, she became real to me. A figure of quiet heroism, walking among us, reminding the world that the worst night of your life doesn't get to define the rest of it. The human spirit, when cornered, does not always crumble. Sometimes it roars. Sometimes it gets up, bleeding and broken, and says, "Is that all you've got?" Erin did more than survive. She taught others how to live after. And maybe that's the most powerful thing of all. Story 4. My mother served in the US Air Force for over 2 decades, a career that shaped both her discipline and her silence. For 23 years she wore the uniform proudly, working primarily as a medic, and during that time, she witnessed things most of us never would. Some beautiful, some brutal, and a few that, even today, she finds difficult to explain. One of her most unsettling stories comes from her time stationed at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany during the 1990s. This was a large historic military hospital, one of the busiest in Europe, and certainly one of the most haunted, according to those who worked its long, echoing corridors. She wasn't the type to believe in ghosts. She trusted protocol, science, and routine. But what happened in that hospital on a quiet night shift was something she never fully forgot. The hospital itself had certain areas that made people uneasy. Even the most rational, grounded staff would avoid some rooms if they could help it. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Doors creaked open with no one behind them. Footsteps echoed through empty halls. But nothing ever escalated. At least, not until that one night, when my mother and a fellow airman were sent to the 4th floor. It was standard procedure to travel in pairs. The buddy system was in place for safety, and that night, she was grateful for it. They took the elevator, pressed the button for the 4th floor, and expected a simple supply run. But the elevator didn't stop at 4. Instead, it began moving erratically, up, down, skipping floors almost as if something was toying with them. Then, without warning, it stopped and opened its doors. What lay beyond the threshold was not the 4th floor as they knew it. It was a hallway neither of them recognized. My mother, who knew the layout of the hospital intimately, said it looked like a different building entirely. The floor was dimly lit, with wallpaper that didn't match any other part of the facility. The doors were older, heavier, and the equipment, what little could be seen, looked like it belonged in another era, possibly decades before. It was as if they'd been taken back in time. But there was no noise, no motion, just silence, stretching down a hallway that should not have existed. Neither of them stepped out. They didn't speak. They only exchanged a glance, and that glance said everything. They both felt it. Something was off, deeply wrong. The doors closed again, and the elevator began to move. It jittered down past floors again, back to the 4th, and this time when the doors opened, everything was back to normal. Familiar white walls, familiar stretchers in the corners, the faint smell of antiseptic. Her partner broke the silence first, whispering, "What just happened?" And my mother could only shake her head, replying softly, "I don't know. They never reported it. They never mentioned it to anyone else. It became one of those moments you file away quietly, not because you're afraid of being laughed at, but because some experiences feel sacred in their strangeness. They don't fit into categories. They don't obey rules. And maybe, on some deep level, you sense that talking about it might bring it back. Over the years, my mother said she heard whispers about other oddities in the building. Nurses who saw figures walk into walls, patients who claimed to see old soldiers standing at the foot of their beds, voices on the intercom that no one had called in. There was a particular stretch of hallway near the old ICU that many staff refused to walk through alone at night. They said the lights flickered too often there. The air felt heavier, and time seemed to stretch oddly. My mother never admitted to seeing anything there herself, but she always walked faster when she had to pass that way. Sometimes silence is its own confession, and the way she avoided that hallway told us everything we needed to know. It makes you wonder about the nature of hospitals. They're places of life and death, of beginnings and endings. How many last breaths have echoed down those walls? How many silent prayers have been whispered under fluorescent lights? It's not hard to imagine that some energy might linger, unresolved, unsettled. My mother believed that if spirits existed, they weren't malicious, just lost, confused, drawn back to the place where their stories ended abruptly. She once told me, if I ever see something again, I won't be afraid. I'll just say, I see you, and keep moving. That was her way of honoring the unexplainable, acknowledging it without fear. Later, when she retired from service, she opened up a little more about her time at Landstuhl. She said she never went back to that 4th floor alone after that night. If her duties called her there, she always made sure someone was with her, even if she had to make up an excuse to bring a trainee or another nurse. It wasn't about fear, it was about respect. She felt like they had been given a glimpse of something they weren't supposed to see, and she didn't want to tempt fate by pushing further. That unknown floor remained etched in her memory, a kind of spatial ghost that refused to disappear. She never found out if anyone else had experienced the same thing. Maybe others did, but like her, chose silence. What I find most compelling about her story isn't just the paranormal aspect, it's how calmly she speaks of it. There's no exaggeration, no attempt to dramatize, just quiet recollection, like someone telling you where they left their keys, only the keys are part of another dimension. It changed the way I think about reality, how thin the line is between what we see and what we don't, how spaces can fold, shift, glitch. Maybe the past doesn't fully disappear, maybe time itself curls in on certain places, especially those charged with emotion and memory. A hospital filled with the trauma of war, the sorrow of loss. It's a place where reality might wear thin. My mother even now believes in logic, medicine and the tangible, but that story remains the one exception to her worldview. There's always room for mystery, she says, usually with a smile. And maybe that's the lesson here, that we don't need to explain everything. Some things are meant to remain unexplained, little reminders that the universe still has secrets. She never tried to chase the truth of that floor. She didn't need to. The experience alone was enough. It was real to her and to the other airmen who stood beside her. And in the end, that might be the only proof that matters. Story 5. 4 years ago, I was a bartender, 25, blonde, and working in one of those high-energy bars where the nights felt endless and the patrons could range from charming to outright terrifying. It was a Friday night, packed with the usual chaos, when my manager realized we were running low on bar supplies. Lemons, limes, bitters, the kind of essentials we needed to survive the weekend. I was sent out to a 24-hour grocery store down the road. I'd done runs like this before without any issue, but this night would change everything about the way I moved through the world. It taught me that you can never be too careful, especially when you're alone. After midnight, in a near-empty store filled with the wrong kind of energy. Everything started off normally. I moved through the aisles quickly, grabbing what I needed with practiced efficiency. I was tired, but focused. Then I turned into the liquor aisle, and that's where I saw them. 2 men standing at the end of the row. They looked to be around my age, maybe a little older. One tall and muscular, the other shorter and heavier, both wearing worn-out clothes and carrying the heavy air of something off. They were staring at me, whispering, and not subtly. My instincts screamed at me, and I decided not to linger. I grabbed the bottles and quickly made my way towards self-checkout, walking fast but not running, trying to stay calm, even though my pulse was climbing. I reached the self-checkout and began scanning my items, but before I could even finish, the 2 men showed up right next to me. They weren't carrying anything. They didn't seem interested in shopping. They were just there, standing too close, watching. I got a better look at them now. The taller one had bloodshot eyes and a look that made my skin crawl, while the shorter one was twitchy, like he'd been up for days. The taller one tried to start a conversation. "Looks like you're ready to party, huh?" I gave him a polite but curt smile and said something like, "Yeah, not for me though." I tried not to make eye contact, tried to appear busy, but he kept going, stepping closer with every sentence. "Must be for your boyfriend, right?" I didn't answer that one. He didn't like being ignored. His tone shifted, more aggressive. He leaned in, close enough for me to smell the stale sweat and alcohol. "You think you're too good for us? We can show you you're not." That line chilled me. I turned slightly, pretending to search for my wallet while discreetly slipping a small pocket knife from my purse into my jacket sleeve. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I needed to be ready. I made sure the self-checkout worker could see me. I looked at her with wide, pleading eyes, hoping she would understand that I needed help. I slid my card through the machine, hoping the transaction would go through quickly. But instead, the screen froze. It started beeping. That noise was a blessing. It brought the worker over immediately. She was tall, solid, with the kind of presence that makes people think twice. The 2 men shifted instantly, trying to act casual, pretending they were just joking around. They made some offhand comment like, "She's stealing something, better check her bag." The worker didn't laugh. She pressed a few buttons, gave them a hard stare, and then turned to me with calm professionalism. "This machine's been acting up. Why don't I ring you up over at the register instead?" She placed a reassuring hand on my back, and in that moment, I knew she had understood everything I was trying to say with my eyes. We walked to a regular register located near the store's security office. I glanced back. The 2 men were still there, pretending to scan items, but clearly watching me. The worker began scanning my things, her eyes still on them. She leaned in and whispered, "There's nothing wrong with the machine. I just had a bad feeling about those guys the minute they came in. I already rang security to walk you out once I saw them acting up." I felt a wave of gratitude. Then she added, "And when I saw you slip something into your sleeve, I knew you were scared. Good instinct. You did the right thing." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion, barely able to speak. As she finished the transaction, she told me we should wait a few more minutes, just in case the men were waiting for me outside. I was hesitant. I peeked toward the exit and saw them still standing there, watching the doors like predators waiting for movement in tall grass. I was terrified to walk to my car alone, and thankfully, I didn't have to. The worker called over the security guard, a stocky man with a calm demeanor and a no-nonsense expression. Together, they walked with me through the quiet, dimly lit parking lot. I clutched my keys tightly, scanning for shadows between the cars. Then I saw it. Toward the back of the lot, partially hidden in darkness, was a large pickup truck with its headlights on, engine running and aimed directly at the store's entrance. It wasn't parked like that before. It was positioned deliberately, like it had moved to get a better view of who was coming out. It didn't make sense, unless they were planning to follow me. As we walked, I made sure not to reveal which car was mine. The security guard was already a step ahead, watching the truck. When we didn't get in immediately and just stared at them instead, they must have realized they'd been spotted. They peeled out, tires screeching, vanishing into the night with a final angry burst of speed. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like forever. I thanked both of them over and over again. I wrote letters to the store's corporate office, hoping the woman would be recognized for what she did that night. She didn't have to help me. It wasn't technically in her job description, but she did. And in doing so, she may have saved me from something far worse than just a scare. I never forgot her face or the strength she radiated in that moment. She became a symbol to me of protection, of quiet courage, of doing the right thing when it counts most. And I promised myself then that I would never go late night shopping alone again. That experience changed me. It wasn't just about fear. It was about the realization of how vulnerable you can be when you're just trying to do something normal. I had always thought I could handle myself, that I was smart enough to spot danger before it became a threat. But evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it slips in quietly beside you in an aisle, smiles with its teeth, and waits for the right moment. I was lucky that night, but I've learned not to count on luck. I've learned to be alert, to trust my gut, and to never, ever underestimate the power of kindness from a stranger who sees you in trouble and chooses to act. Story 6. I was new to the boat, freshly stationed and still learning the layout of the submarine's lower levels. It was the mid-watch, the deep hours of night when the world above sleeps and silence echoes like a hum through the metal bones of the vessel. I had a task to complete, a simple one. Identify a specific piece of equipment in the engine room, something I could later rattle off to a watchstander to show I knew my way around. That night, I moved through the narrow metal halls of the engine room lower level, my steps cautious, my flashlight cutting long shadows. The lower bay was always unsettling. Tight passageways, humming pipes, and darkness that seemed to lean in a little too close. I descended one of the ladders into the lower engine bay and immediately noticed movement. About 15 feet ahead of me, someone walked across the ship. I could hear the footsteps, steady and calm, and caught a glimpse of the figure disappearing around the corner. Nothing strange at first. I figured it was another sailor finishing rounds. But something didn't feel right. 3 things, actually. First, the uniform. The person had been wearing utilities, a light blue blouse and dark navy slacks, the old-style navy uniform. We hadn't worn those in years. They were officially phased out 3 years prior. No one on board had them anymore. Second, I was the only person scheduled in that part of the ship during this time. The only other person awake in the engine room was a senior watchstander, and I knew for a fact he was behind me, waiting at the top of the ladder for my return. Third, and most disturbingly, he wasn't actually there. I turned the corner where I thought the man had gone. No one. The space was narrow and enclosed. No place to hide. No doors to slip through. The air was cold and oddly still. My flashlight beam wavered slightly, and for a moment I convinced myself it was just stress. Or maybe sleep deprivation. I was tired. That had to be it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the space, that I had just brushed against something that didn't belong to the world of the living. I wrapped up my inspection and climbed the ladder, keeping my thoughts to myself. I didn't want to sound paranoid. You guys always tried to prove they weren't spooked by the boat. I wasn't about to be the exception. Months passed, and I had mostly pushed the event out of my mind. The sea demands routine, and routine becomes a wall against unease. Then, on a different submarine of the same class, I was assigned temporarily for training. One evening, while chatting with a sailor who had previously served on my original boat, I asked him casually if he had ever experienced anything strange in the engine room. He paused, visibly uncomfortable, and then In a tone that made my skin prickle, he said, "Yeah, we had a guy take his life down there, on watch. It was years ago. Found him in the engine bay, dressed in full utilities." My stomach dropped. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Everything came rushing back. The footsteps, the faded uniform, the silence around the corner. He continued, unaware of what I was remembering. "You know, people said they still saw him. No joke. We always thought it was made up to scare the new guys, but yeah." I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice, and thought about how many stories had probably been buried beneath steel and steam. The Navy doesn't talk much about ghosts. We talk about procedures, repairs, schedules, but I think every boat has its stories. Passed around in whispers during late-night watches, dismissed with laughter but never truly forgotten. There's something about being submerged, sealed away from the world, that invites those stories to root themselves deep inside. Later that night, I found myself alone again, down in the belly of another engine room. Same hum, same darkness. I couldn't help but wonder if every submarine had a ghost, or if some ghosts just didn't know how to leave. Maybe they stay because the silence feels like home. Maybe they're caught in a loop, reliving the same watch forever. Or maybe they're not even aware they've lingered, walking the same path each night, unnoticed by most, until someone like me looks up at the wrong moment and sees them. I never saw the figure again, but I always looked. Every time I walked past that spot, every time I descended a ladder into that space. And some sailors claim to have heard footsteps where there shouldn't be any, or felt someone brush past them in an empty compartment. Some say they've seen flickers in the corner of their eyes that vanish when they turn to look. Most laugh it off. But the ones who've really seen something, they don't laugh. They get quiet. They nod slowly, like they've joined a club no one wants to be in. After that deployment, I started asking more questions, gently, always gently, and I learnt more than I expected. Stories that mirrored mine. Different ships, different names, but always the same weight behind the words. When you live beneath the surface for months at a time, your mind becomes attuned to every creak, every shift in pressure. It's easy to explain things away. Submarines are noisy, unpredictable machines. But sometimes it's not the machine making the noise. Sometimes it's something else, something that lingers. My encounter didn't drive me to fear the job, but it reminded me that we don't understand everything, that even in a place ruled by metal and logic, mystery finds a way in. And when it does, it leaves just enough behind for the curious to wonder. I still serve. I still walk those corridors. But I carry that moment with me. 15 feet of passageway in the shadow that shouldn't have existed. And on the longest nights, when the world above is a distant memory, and the silence wraps around you like a second skin, I remember that we're not always alone down there. Not truly. The engine room keeps its secrets. The walls remember, and every now and then, if you're quiet, and if you listen close, you might hear footsteps echo in places no living sailor stands. Story 7. I used to work at a small, family-owned bicycle shop, a cozy place that had been around for years, nestled in a modest neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other. The owner was a kind man, a father of two, who ran the business with a calm steadiness that earned the respect of everyone who walked through the doors. His wife often helped out, and his young daughter would sometimes sit in the corner behind the register, doing her homework while her parents worked. I had only been there a short while, but in that time, I came to see the shop as more than a job. It was a place that felt like family. That is, until one ordinary afternoon changed everything in the blink of an eye. It was a day like any other. I was rearranging displays near the front of the store, adjusting handlebars and aligning rows of helmets, while the family chatted and moved about their daily routines. The soft hum of conversation filled the space, the sound of tires being inflated, chains being oiled, and tools clinking on the workbench. The door was propped open to let in the breeze, and the sun cast a warm glow across the tiled floor. Then, without warning, the front door slammed open with a force that shattered the quiet. A man burst inside, and before anyone could react, raised a pistol and began firing. Not a word, no shouting, just the sudden, deafening eruption of violence. The shots echoed off the walls like thunder. I felt the sting of something in my abdomen, a hot, searing pain that dropped me to the floor. Chaos followed, the sound of glass shattering, a scream, the thud of bodies hitting the ground. Through the haze of shock and the ringing in my ears, I realized that my boss had been hit multiple times. I saw his body slump forward, lifeless, before it even touched the ground. Blood spread across the tiles, mixing with shattered glass and twisted metal. His daughter had been hit in the arm. His wife, in a desperate attempt to shield her, had broken her own arm, diving to the floor. It was carnage, the kind of moment that tears reality into pieces. The man fled as quickly as he had come, disappearing into the crowded streets of Eloy, a city in the Philippines where life moved fast and justice often moved slow. The police were called and everything became a blur of sirens, questions and stunned silence. We later found out that the attack had something to do with a debt, money my boss allegedly owed the gunman. But those details felt hollow, meaningless compared to what had happened. A man had walked into a shop full of laughter and bicycles and turned it into a scene of horror, and no one could ever explain why it had to end that way. Not really. The wound in my stomach required surgery, and I spent weeks recovering in a hospital bed, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. I couldn't stop seeing the look on my boss's face in the final second before the bullet took him. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Confusion, maybe. The kind of look that says, how could this be happening here? He had spent his life building something good, something decent, and in just a few seconds, it was gone. The shop closed temporarily after the shooting. Police came and went. The community mourned. And the man who pulled the trigger? To this day, I don't know if he was ever caught. After I was discharged from the hospital, I visited the shop once more. It was empty then, the shelves bare, the floor scrubbed but still bearing faint stains that wouldn't come out. The window had been replaced, but the light didn't feel the same. It was colder, more distant. I stood there in silence, remembering the way things had been. The smell of rubber and grease, the sound of laughter, the small joys of tuning up a bike for a neighborhood kid, all of it felt like another life, one I could never fully return to. Trauma has a way of splitting time, before and after, and I now lived entirely in the after. I kept in touch with the wife and daughter. They moved away eventually, needing to escape the constant reminders. The daughter recovered physically, but emotionally she became quiet, withdrawn. Her laughter didn't come as easily anymore. The wife, who once smiled at every customer, now wore a guarded expression. And who could blame her? When your world is shattered by someone you never even knew, trust becomes a difficult thing to rebuild. I sometimes wonder what their lives look like now, whether they've found peace, whether the memories still haunt their dreams the way they do mine. The hardest part about surviving something like that isn't the pain or even the fear. It's the guilt. The question that creeps in at night when the world goes quiet. Why did I live? Why did he die? I still don't have the answer. Maybe I never will. But I've learned not to run from the memory. I carry it. I honor it. I tell the story when people ask, not to spread fear, but to remind others that even in the most familiar places, darkness can arrive without warning, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, like a quiet man fixing bicycles for his neighbours, deserve to be remembered more than the senseless act that ended his life. In time, I returned to work, not at a bike shop but somewhere quieter, less public. The sound of slamming doors still makes me flinch. I still scan the faces of strangers with an instinct I didn't used to have. But I also hold on to the good, the warmth of that small community, the resilience of a family torn apart but still standing, and the memory of a man who showed me what dignity and patience looked like, day after day. He may be gone, but the shop he built, the kindness he offered, and the trust he gave to those around him live on in those of us who knew him. Story 8. I used to work in the US Air Force in munitions systems, code 2W0X1 if you want the technical term. My job wasn't flashy. It involved towing heavy trailers filled with ordnance and moving them back and forth between storage and the flight line. Most of my shifts happened under the cover of night. The base was in New Mexico, surrounded by miles of sand, silence, and a sky so wide it made you feel small. You'd think that in such a place, away from the bustle of life, there wouldn't be much to worry about. But the desert has its own secrets. And one night, while doing a routine check near the conventional munitions shop, I came face to face with something I still can't explain. It was a quiet night, no wind, no distractions. I had been assigned to hook up a trailer parked beside the shop, positioned right next to the security fence that bordered the far end of the facility. I was alone, as I often was, and I moved methodically around the trailer, flashlight in hand, checking tires and connection points. I was focused on the task, lost in my usual rhythm, when my beam caught something beyond the fence. Just a flicker, a motion, a shape that didn't quite belong. My breath caught. I froze and raised the light higher, sweeping it slowly across the dark field that lay beyond the fence line. Nothing, just desert and night. But something had been there. I knew it. For a long moment, I stood perfectly still, ears straining for sound. The desert is a strange place after dark. It swallows noise and time alike. I turned off the flashlight for a second, letting my eyes adjust. My pulse thudded in my ears. Then I finished hooking up the trailer, trying to shake off the unease. But the feeling didn't fade. The air had shifted, thicker somehow, as if I were being watched. I reported the trailer was ready and left the site. The next day I mentioned it casually to a buddy in conventional. I didn't want to sound paranoid, just curious if anyone had seen anything weird out by the fence line recently. That's when he told me something that made my skin crawl. He said they'd found fresh tracks near the same fence, barefoot, scattered all over the sand. There were no roads back there, no reason for anyone to be walking in that area, especially without boots or gear. The tracks had triggered a report to security forces, and patrols had been increased in that quadrant. The strangest part, the direction of the tracks. They weren't leading toward the base. They were circling it, like someone or something had been watching. I laughed it off at first, said something about coyotes or base kids playing pranks, but he didn't smile. His eyes were serious. "You ever hear of skinwalkers?" he asked. Had, of course. Growing up in the Southwest, stories about skinwalkers were part of the background noise. According to Native American legend, specifically Navajo, skinwalkers are shape-shifting witches, creatures that can mimic human form or animal, known to spy on people, to steal identities, to feed on fear. I had always treated those stories like folklore, something you told around campfires, but my friend was Native, and he wasn't joking. He said they're known to target people who are alone, especially in isolated places. They don't just scare you, he said. They take something from you, a piece of who you are. He told me about the burial grounds that had once been nearby, leveled when the base was built. The land was sacred, he said, and some believed disturbing it had consequences. Whether or not I believed that didn't seem to matter. The fear he spoke with was real, and that made me uneasy in a way no ghost story ever had. From that point on, I made a decision. I would never again go out to that part of the base alone, not if I could help it. I started coordinating my duties to make sure I had someone with me. I took detours. I kept my flashlight on even when it wasn't needed. You learn to follow your instincts out there. And mine was screaming at me to stay away. There was one night a few weeks later when I was on a different shift, partnered up with a younger airman. We were doing another trailer check, different area, but still on the outskirts of the base. As we were pulling up, the vehicle's headlights caught a flash of movement in the distance, just beyond the trees. A shadow darted between two rows of containers, too fast and too fluid to be human. I turned to the airman beside me. He'd seen it too. We didn't say a word. We just got out, did the inspection in record time, and got the hell out. Later, he asked me if I thought it was a person. I told him honestly, I didn't know, and that was the truth. After that night, I started hearing more stories. Quiet whispers in the break room, off-the-record conversations between shifts. Everyone had something. A night they saw movement where there shouldn't have been any, a shadow that followed them, a voice that called their name when no one was there. The stories weren't always the same, but the tone was. That hush in the voice, that weight behind the words, these weren't just stories anymore. They were warnings. Unspoken agreements that some things on the base weren't meant to be understood. That sometimes the desert didn't want us there. I stayed stationed there for another year. Nothing dramatic happened after that, but I never forgot that night by the fence, that strange stillness, the tracks, the way the air felt, like it had teeth. I don't know if skinwalkers are real, but I know what fear feels like. I know what it means when your instincts try to pull you out of your own body and scream at you to run. And I know that in some places, after midnight, it's not just about the darkness, it's about what moves inside it, quiet, watching, waiting for you to forget that you're not alone.